The silver bullet burned a hole through his ribs. It lodged a millimeter from his heart. Bastian slammed the armored door of the SUV, shaking as the leather seats drank the blood spilling from his suit. He was dying. That part was fine. The real terror was the feral thing thrashing inside his skull, clawing at the bars of his sanity. He tasted battery acid, copper, the world smeared into predatory red. Neon lights bled across the tinted glass as the driver shouted muffled static from the front. Bones ground together in Bastian's neck. The lichen wanted the wheel. It wanted to tear the city down to its studs to heal the damage. Tires squealed against the concrete of the underground garage beneath his club. Bastian kicked the door. He spilled out into the exhaust, hitting the pavement hard. Every breath dragged a jagged blade through his lungs. He shoved into the restricted corridor, smearing a wet handprint down the plaster. He didn't want his crew seeing their alpha crawling like a gut-shot stray. He needed a dark hole to lock himself away before the shift cracked him open and forced him to butcher his own men. His knees gave out. He crashed through the doors of the VIP lounge. Black marble and the sting of spilled whiskey greeted him as he hit the floor. The doors swung shut, sealing him inside the dark. The ringing in his ears faded into the hum of the ventilation system. Then the stench hit him. Bleach. Bastian dragged his chin up from the cold tile. Golden light flooded his vision. Someone else was breathing in the dark. The cold marble bit into his palms as the beast surged forward. Bastian extended his claws, carving white gouges across the floor tiles to drag his broken body further into the room. Blind aggression narrowed his focus to a single silhouette standing by the leather booths. A plastic bucket tipped. Water slapped against the floor. She was just a cleaner, drenched in some foul gel that fought the metallic reek of his spilled blood. He pushed up onto his hands and knees. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, rattling the empty glasses on the tables. Killers had pissed themselves running from that sound. The girl didn't run. Wood cracked like a gunshot. She brought her knee up, snapping the mop handle in two, and gripped the splintered end like a stake. White knuckles, balanced stance. She aimed the jagged wood straight at his throat. The feral roar inside Bastian's head hit a brick wall. Prey ran. Prey screamed. He stared at her through the gloom. Her cheap uniform hung off her frame, hair knotted tight against her skull. Yet her dark eyes held zero pity. She looked at the alpha of the underworld like he was a rat in her kitchen. The raging fire in his veins cooled a fraction. The man grabbed the reins back from the monster. He needed that defiance to anchor him to the floor. "Get back!" Her voice trembled against the silence, but the command cut through the dark like a blade. Bastian tried to answer. A wet cough hacked out of his throat, spraying red across the tile. His muscles gave up. He slumped sideways, his shoulder crashing into the base of the booth. Dust motes drifted through the neon light slanting through the blinds. He waited for the stake to drive through his neck. Instead, her boots shifted on the wet tile. The splintered wood clattered against the marble floor. Before the echo died, her knees hit the tile beside him. Calloused hands slammed down directly over the bullet wound in his ribs. Bastian jerked. A snarl ripped past his teeth. "Don't touch." She leaned her weight into the puncture, forcing the bleeding to slow. "Shut up and hold still. If you die here, they'll blame me." Her pulse hammered against his skin. The heat radiating off her arms dragged at his self-control. The beast wanted to sink its teeth into her wrist and claim the heat. Then the blood soaked through. Lichen blood saturated the cotton of her uniform, pooling against her knuckles. It hit the chemical gel smeared across her skin. A low hiss bubbled in the air. The chemical stink began to curdle and burn away under the supernatural heat of his blood. The bleach dissolved. Her true scent hit the air. Bastian stopped breathing. It wasn't the dull static of a human, and it wasn't the wet dog rot of a rogue. It was crushed pine, ozone, and lightning. Pure silver. Royalty. The agonizing burn in his chest vanished under a tidal wave of instinct. A royal bloodline was kneeling in the dirt, scrubbing his floors. The authoritative weight of her scent chained the feral madness instantly. His hand shot out. fingers clamped around her wrist like a steel trap. The girl flinched, her mask of indifference fractured as she tried to rip her arm away. The grip held. "You!" Bastian dropped his voice into a lethal purr. The Alpha stared up at the crown jewel of the city. "What are you?" Her pulse spiked against his palm. The secret was bleeding out onto the floor between them, and he tightened his grip, pulling her an inch closer to his teeth. The neon-lit room shrank to the size of a coffin. Bastian held her slender wrist, pressing his thumb against her pulse. It beat with the frantic rhythm of a trapped bird. The noxious stench of bleach was gone entirely, replaced by the electrifying aroma of her blood. It smelled like hot asphalt and crackling ozone. She jerked backward, her boots scraped against the wet marble, muscles locked tight beneath her cheap uniform, pulling her posture into a cornered crouch as the steel trap of his grip held firm. "Let me go," she hissed, her voice a desperate whisper. He didn't let go. The deep vibration in his chest rattled his fractured ribs. The silver bullet still burned, but the agonizing heat bled away into a dull ache. The sheer proximity of her royal blood forced his torn cells to aggressively knit themselves back together. Wood splintered inward. The double doors of the VIP lounge crashed open. 3 armed enforcers rushed across the threshold, their tactical rifles raised and hunting. The room froze. Rifle barrels dipped toward the floorboards as the kinetic violence died in the air. The sight of their bleeding Alpha kneeling over a club cleaner stalled their momentum entirely. Bastian shifted his weight. He dragged his broad shoulder forward, dropping himself like a physical wall between his men and the girl. "Stand down." The command scraped out of his ruined throat, leaving zero room for debate. The men lowered their weapons. They traded confused glances over the iron sights, unable to smell the rain and ozone through the thick reek of copper choking the lounge. "Get the car ready," Bastian ordered. He tracked the tiny muscle jumping in her cheek. He watched her fingers curl into tight fists against her thighs. "We are going to the penthouse, and she's coming with us." "But boss..." "The contract," one guard started. "Buy it out." Bastian bared his teeth, letting the fangs flash in the dim light. "I don't care who holds her debt. Pay them double. Wipe the ledger clean right now." Her scent spiked. A bitter tang of absolute terror cut through the ozone. She didn't want the golden cage he was building around her. He didn't want a captive servant. But right now, keeping her in his shadow was the only way to keep them both breathing. Bastian planted his boots. He forced his knees to lock, ignoring the tearing sensation in his side, and stood tall. The feral noise in his skull went completely dead. Reaching down, he hooked his arm behind her knees and pulled her off the floor. She went rigid, holding her spine as stiff as a board to avoid resting her head against his chest. He carried her past his silent guards, boots crunching over the broken glass, dragging her straight into his war. The tires of the armored SUV had barely cooled in the subterranean garage before dawn bled gray light across the penthouse windows. Bastian stood over his oak desk, a fresh bandage strapped tight around his torso. The toxic slug sat in a bloody dish near his knuckles. His flesh was stitching shut, yet his gaze remained locked on the reinforced glass of the guest bedroom. She paced like a caged leopard. Through the tinted barrier, he watched her rattle the brass window latches. She pressed her ear against the drywall. Her boot tapped the floorboards, hunting for hollow spaces. She was entirely focused on finding a structural weakness in his fortress. Bastian dragged a large hand over his rough jaw. The feral static in his brain was gone. The simple fact that she breathed the same filtered air grounded him, pulling the man back from the edge of the monster. He picked up a silver tray. Steam curled off the plate of roasted meat. Keys rattled in the lock before he pushed the door inward. The girl spun. Her heels hit the cold glass of the window, putting the entire room between them. Her chin tipped up, holding the line with beautiful defiance despite the sour scent of fear rolling off her skin. "Eat," Bastian commanded, setting the tray on the edge of the mattress. She didn't look at the plate. "I want to go back to the club. My shift isn't over yet." A dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. "You don't have a shift anymore. I own your contract. You own a piece of paper. She didn't blink, her words dripping with lethal venom. You don't own me. The venom hit him like a physical blow. A ghost memory surfaced, a wild falcon locked in a steel cage, battering its wings against the bars until its feathers turned red. It chose starvation over submission. He had ultimately unlatched the door and let the bird fly. He couldn't let this girl fly. The concrete jungle would rip her apart by noon. I know what you are. Bastian took a slow step forward, the leather of his boots creaking against the hardwood. I smelled the silver in your veins. If you walk out that door today, every predator in this city will hunt you down. The ozone scent curdled. She crossed her arms, folding inward to build a physical wall against the truth. Bastian stopped moving. He pointed a single finger at the steaming plate. Eat the food. You need your strength. He backed out of the room, listening to the heavy lock click shut, waiting for the first strike of a war she didn't know she was fighting. The brass lock had barely settled into place when the private elevator chimed across the sprawling room. Bastian turned away from the bedroom door, just as Marcus stepped out of the polished steel box. The beta looked wrecked. Gunpowder and stale sweat clung to his wrinkled collar. Marcus had spent the entire night scrubbing the alleyway clean of their spilled blood. We lost 3 good men, Marcus said grimly. He walked straight to the wet bar, pouring amber liquor into a crystal glass. The rival pack denies any involvement, but I found tire tracks matching their standard fleet. I want your authorization to strike their warehouse tonight. Bastian leaned his hip against the oak desk. His ears tracked the clinking ice in the glass. He had bled with this man in the gutters for 10 years, trusting him with the keys to the empire. Hold the strike, Bastian replied. We don't move a muscle until we have undeniable proof. The air pressure in the penthouse snapped. Bastian stopped breathing. The scent of ozone leaking from the bedroom door didn't just spike with panic. It flooded the room with pure, suffocating hatred. He tracked the sound. Through the thick drywall, a frantic pulse echoed like a war drum. She wasn't reacting to his presence. She hadn't spiked like this when he cornered her with the truth. She was reacting to the voice at the bar. The jagged puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening crunch. The dead look in her eyes at the club. The desperate way she guarded her bloodline. Bastian stared at the man, pouring a second drink. He looked past the loyal smile, staring directly at the ruthless ambition hiding in his beta's shadow. Who was the girl? Marcus asked casually. He gestured with his glass toward the locked door. The guard said, you brought a bloody cleaner back from the club. If you need a distraction, there are cleaner ways to handle it. The monster inside Bastian bared its teeth. He kept his facial muscles entirely loose, painting on a sculpted mask of bored authority. She's nobody, Bastian lied smoothly. His tone was perfectly dismissive. Just a human who saw too much during the ambush. I'm holding her here until we clear the board. The ice cracked in the glass. Bastian looked at his oldest friend, realizing the knife aimed at his back was already in the room. A starving animal is the most dangerous creature in the room. Growing up fighting for scraps in the gutters taught Bastian the sharp edge of true hunger. Through the bulletproof glass of the safe room, he watched the girl intently. She hadn't touched the silver tray he brought her hours ago. Instead, the roasted meat sat cold against the porcelain. While his pulse dragged, he mapped her perfectly still posture. She sat on the edge of the mattress, keeping her spine straight and her eyes locked on the steel frame. Her scent carried a complex storm. It tasted like crackling ozone, sweet rain, and the bitter tang of starvation. Punishing herself was her only way to maintain control. He couldn't let her starve, especially when her physical weakness made the beast scratching at his ribs completely frantic. Bastian grabbed the iron handle. He pushed the door inward, letting the hinges shriek against the quiet air. Without speaking, he pulled a wrapped protein bar from his tactical vest. He crossed the concrete floor. Offering her cold steak was a mistake. She would never accept charity from a warlord. He ripped the foil wrapper open with his teeth. The dry bar snapped exactly in half with a sharp crack. He tossed one piece onto her lap. Leaning his shoulders against the cinder block wall, Bastian took a deliberate bite of his own ration. Sharing the chalky food shifted the air pressure. He wasn't feeding a captive. He was splitting rations with a fellow survivor. Keeping his gaze anchored to the floorboards, he listened to the fabric of her uniform shift. Her chest rose and fell in a jagged rhythm. The stubborn pride finally fractured against the crushing weight of empty survival. Fingers brushed against the foil. She took a hesitant bite. A tiny window opened in the dark. The hum of the ventilation system filled the space as a fragile truce settled over the cold cell. Bastian breathed in the ozone. A fierce ache bloomed behind his sternum, a terrifying urge to burn down the entire city just to keep the concrete beneath her boots safe. Red light violently washed out the dark. A deafening siren shattered the quiet, screaming through the compound corridors. Bastian pushed off the wall. The truce was dead, and someone was going to bleed for it. Fury propels a lichen faster than logic. Bastian tore through the flashing hallways of the compound, driving his combat boots into the concrete. Gun smoke and burned wire choked the narrow corridors. Intruders. The breach wasn't at the main vault. The smoke trailed straight toward the guest quarters. Panic dug its claws into his throat. He rounded the final corner, extending his claws to tear flesh from bone, ready to rip the threat apart. Then, he froze in the shadows. He didn't find the girl cowering. He found a rogue operative backing her into a dead-end alcove. The intruder grinned under the pulsing red emergency lights, holding a serrated knife. Before Bastian could lunge, the girl moved. She stepped directly into the attacker's space with lethal intent. It was a blur of fluid, trained motion. She grabbed the man's thick wrist, twisted her hips, and used his own momentum against him. Bone cracked like a gunshot over the blaring alarms. The blade clattered onto the linoleum. The operative hit his knees, screaming in blind agony as his arm bent backward at a horrific angle. Standing perfectly still in the dark, Bastian watched the chilling emptiness wash over her dark eyes. She didn't hesitate. Her boot snapped up in a brutal kick to the man's jaw, dropping him unconscious into a puddle of his own blood. Red warning lights spun across the ceiling. The harsh mechanical wail of the siren drowned out the wet sound of her ragged breathing. She stood over the broken body. Bastian tracked the blood dripping from the operative's chin. He remembered the brutal training pits of his youth where scarred veterans broke limbs to teach lessons. This wasn't a desperate street brawl. This was terrifyingly precise combat logic. Club cleaners didn't fight like royal assassins. As the ozone scent flared in the corridor, she slowly turned her head. She looked straight into the pitch-black alcove where Bastian was standing. She knew he had watched the entire violent display. He stepped out into the bleeding red light, realizing he hadn't locked a frightened girl in his house. He had caged a loaded weapon, and she was already aimed at his throat. The steel doors of the security office slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic shouting of the cleanup crew dragging bodies down the hall. Bastian paced the length of the cramped room. Spilled blood and sharp ozone coated the back of his tongue. He stopped. He glared down at the girl sitting rigid in a plastic chair. "Where did you learn to do that?" Bastian growled low in his chest. The rough demand scraped against the acoustic tiles. She didn't flinch, staring straight through his torso. "I asked you a question." He stepped into her space, letting his broad shadow swallow her entirely. "That was Royal Guard training. I know the stances. I know the breaks. I survived the exile pits, and I know exactly what I just saw." The silence stretched until she finally tipped her chin up. "I mop floors. I picked up a few tricks to keep drunks away." "Liar." Bastian leaned down, planting his palms on the plastic armrests to box her in. "You are silver-blooded. You fight like an elite soldier. Someone trained you to survive." Leaning this close, the bitter scent of an old, buried sorrow rose off her skin. It was a grief so profound it made his own ribs physically ache. Before she could spin another lie, the brass doorknob turned. Bastian snapped upright, locking his jaw. Marcus stepped over the threshold. The beta wiped dark soot from his collar, his sharp eyes instantly darting to the girl in the chair. "The perimeter is secure," Marcus said smoothly. His calm voice sounded entirely wrong against the violent ringing in Bastian's ears. The air pressure shifted. Bastian tracked his second-in-command carefully. Marcus didn't look at the girl with the dismissive arrogance he usually reserved for humans. A flicker of cold recognition flashed behind the beta's eyes. "Is the prisoner causing you trouble, Alpha?" Marcus asked. The fake, indulgent condescension in his tone made Bastian's inner beast bare its teeth. The trap snapped shut. Marcus was testing the water. He recognized the lost royal bloodline sitting right here under the fluorescent lights. Bastian stepped smoothly into the gap, planting his boots to block Marcus's view of the girl. "She is my concern. Go back to the perimeter." "Of course, boss." Marcus smiled thinly, taking a slow step backward into the hall. "We wouldn't want ghosts from the past causing problems for the syndicate." The latch clicked shut. Dust drifted through the harsh overhead lights as the room went dead silent. Bastian swallowed the copper taste in his mouth. The knife aimed at his back belonged to his most trusted brother, and the war had just breached his front door. The silence of the safe house pressed against his eardrums. Bastian woke with a violent jerk. The king-sized bed was empty, but the cold sheets weren't what made his pulse hammer against his ribs. The scent of ozone and sweet rain was fading, drifting out into the compound corridors. Raw panic dug its claws into his throat. He threw the blanket aside, grabbing the tactical sidearm from the nightstand. He tracked the scent through the dark. His bare feet made zero sound against the concrete. The biometric locks on the guest suite were heavily encrypted. She had bypassed them entirely, proving she was infinitely more dangerous than he had calculated. He had locked a bird in a cage, only to realize she held the keys to the entire castle. The silver scent pulled him down to the lowest level of the subterranean bunker, the secure server room. A heavy steel door stood ajar, bleeding pale blue light onto the linoleum. Bastian stepped into the doorway. He found her illuminated by the massive monitors. She wasn't running for the exit. Her fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard with terrifying, practiced speed, slicing straight through his multi-million-dollar firewalls. She was so intensely focused, she didn't hear him enter. He watched her profile. The deadly focus, the buried pain, the absolute, undeniable courage. A chilling realization froze the blood in his veins. She wasn't running from him. She was hunting someone inside his house. "Looking for something specific?" Bastian rumbled softly. Her fingers froze over the keys, her breath caught in the quiet room. Yet she didn't scramble away from the terminal. She turned to face him slowly. Cold, hollow fury burned in her dark eyes. She pointed a shaking finger at the glowing screen. "I found it," she whispered, her voice tight. "I found the ghost." Bastian closed the distance. He looked past her shoulder at the monitor. It was a deeply buried, highly classified ledger from 5 years ago, detailing the coordinated massacre of the last ruling Silverblood pack in the Northern Territory. A cold weight dropped into his stomach. The digital authorization signature at the bottom of the massacre order belonged to him. The air pressure between them snapped. "You ordered the hit," she breathed. She stepped backward until her spine hit the server rack. "You slaughtered my family." Bastian stared at the screen. He remembered that night perfectly. He had been miles away, bleeding out in a turf war by the docks. He had never ordered a hit on a royal bloodline. He knew exactly who forged that digital signature. Marcus. Bastian reached a hand out toward her. She flinched violently, her face twisting in pure agony. He needed to prove his innocence, but his name was written in her family's blood. He had to find the beta before the betrayal tore them apart entirely. The underground interrogation room smelled of sweat and cheap copper. Bastian gripped the steel chair, turning his knuckles white. The rival gang member tied to the seat sobbed, spitting broken teeth onto the damp concrete. The feral beast inside Bastian's skull roared, deafening his human thoughts. A homicidal rage had been boiling under his skin since he saw that forged ledger. He dragged this rival informant into the dark to extract the truth about Marcus's treason. The fragile chains holding his sanity snapped. The monster clawed at the back of his skull, demanding to be let off the leash. "I don't know," the informant screamed, thrashing against the ropes. "Marcus just pays us to watch the borders. That's it." Bastian's vision flooded red. A terrifying, guttural snarl ripped from his throat. Bones popped and cracked in his shoulders, shifting violently beneath his shirt. Venom dripped from his extended fangs. He was going to execute the man. He was going to rip the informant's head off right in front of his elite guard. If he did that, he officially became the Mad King. He would prove he was too feral to rule. The beast lunged forward, a blur of unstoppable muscle and fury. A small figure stepped directly into his path. It was her. She threw herself between the raging lichen and the bleeding captive. Bastian couldn't stop his forward momentum. His clawed hands slammed into the concrete wall on either side of her head, caging her. His chest heaved. Hot, angry breath washed over her pale face. He was feral. He was completely lost. She didn't cower. She didn't scream for help. She reached up with both hands. She grabbed his blood-soaked, heavily scarred face, pressing her thumbs firmly into his jawline. "Look at me," she demanded. Her voice didn't shake. It was pure royal command. The bond pulsed. She deliberately pushed her fear away and dropped her scent blockers entirely. The blinding scent of silver and thunderstorm crashed into Bastian's ruined senses. It hit him like a physical blow, an ice-cold bucket of water drowning a house fire. The feral beast stopped thrashing immediately. Clarity hit him like lightning. He blinked heavily. The violent red haze vanished, replaced by the deep brown of her eyes. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at him. The massive Alpha King's legs gave out. He dropped hard to his knees, burying his face directly into her soft stomach. He wrapped his arms around her waist, trembling violently as the human clawed his way back to the surface. The entire room of hardened killers stared in absolute shock. Their lethal warlord had just submitted to a club cleaner. Bastian inhaled her scent, feeling the broken pieces of his soul knitting back together. She hadn't just stopped an execution. She had saved his humanity. The metal doors of the armory slammed shut, sealing Bastian and the girl inside. Dead silence contrasted sharply with the chaos they left in the interrogation room. Bastian walked to the steel table, his chest heaving from the adrenaline of the near shift. He pulled out a secure tablet, slamming it onto the metal surface. "Look closely," he commanded, his voice a rough rumble. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she stepped up to the table. He pulled up the digital ledger from the server room. Next, he pulled up older, verified syndicate contracts. "My father taught me how to spot a traitor before I could walk," Bastian said quietly, tracing his finger over the glowing screen. "Look at the signature on your family's massacre order. The encryption key has a microscopic fracture in the code. It's a ghost slice." She leaned in close. Her arm brushed against his. Fire bloomed beneath her skin, sending an electric shock straight through his veins. "Marcus," she whispered. Realization dawned in her dark eyes. "He copied your signature. He used your authority to wipe out my bloodline." "Yes," Bastian growled the word deep in his chest. "And he's doing it again. He wants me to go feral so the Syndicate Council will legally execute me. Then he takes the throne." The true scope of the betrayal settled heavily over the room. He had bled with Marcus. That trusted brother was the architect of both their nightmares. "So?" she said, turning to look up at him. Her face set in a mask of terrifying resolve. "What do we do now?" He loved that question. He loved the we. Bastian reached under the steel table. He pulled out a matte black tactical harness, loaded with silver daggers and sleek firearms, tossing it onto the table between them. "We take back my city," Bastian replied, his golden eyes flashing with lethal intent. "And we tear out his throat." The external breach alarm activated. A screeching, deafening wail tore through the compound. It wasn't a drill or a minor perimeter issue. It was the master lockdown siren. Bastian knew exactly what was happening. The beta hadn't waited for the council. Marcus was initiating a heavily armed coup right now. Bastian racked the slide of his heavy rifle. He looked at the woman beside him, his anchor, his queen, his only hope for survival. "Stay behind me," he ordered. The armory door began to rattle violently under the impact of explosives. The real war was only just beginning. The steel door buckled inward. Plaster rained down like dirty snow, coating the linoleum floor. Bastian gripped his rifle, letting the vibration rattle through his palms. Marcus was blowing a hole straight into the armory. Burning in a cage wasn't an option. He turned to the girl. Ozone and sharp adrenaline washed over the air between them. She wasn't shaking. Instead, she stood perfectly still, mapping the dented steel with lethal focus. Explosives rocked the foundation again. White dust billowed into the air. Bastian waited for the ringing in his ears to fade into the hiss of the broken water pipes. Then, he moved. He grabbed a silver dagger from the table. Next, he pulled a tactical belt loaded with spare clips. He didn't order her into a corner or treat her like a fragile civilian. He packed the silver rounds, he racked the slide, he held the blade out. Fingers wrapped around the hilt. Cold metal passed between them as her knuckles brushed his skin. A jolt of electricity shot straight up his forearm. Words weren't necessary. Dark eyes locked onto his, burning with undeniable purpose. Taking the blade meant accepting the war. She strapped the leather belt around her waist like armor. Pride swelled behind Bastian's ribs. He had bled alongside brutal killers his entire life, yet this partnership felt entirely different. She anchored him to the floor. "There is a maintenance hatch beneath the floor grates." Bastian pointed toward the shadows. "It drops straight down into the garage." She nodded. The ozone scent spiked with fierce determination. Metal hinges shrieked. The steel frame snapped under the pressure. Marcus's soldiers were seconds away from tearing the room apart. Bastian kicked the iron grate aside. He dropped into the narrow shaft, landing smoothly on the concrete below. She followed an instant later, hitting the ground with the silence of a ghost. Boots clattered against the floorboards directly above their skulls. The hunt was driving them down into the dark. Hitting the bottom of the maintenance shaft dragged the stench of motor oil and damp concrete deep into his lungs. Bastian crouched in the shadows of the subterranean garage, letting his pupils dilate in the gloom. Neon lights flickered overhead. The concrete ceiling compressed the air, making every breath burn. Syndicate soldiers swept through the parked cars. Laser sights cut through the exhaust fumes like red spiders. Adrenaline pushed Bastian's inner beast against his skull. The monster didn't fight for control. It synced perfectly with the man, anchored by the royal bloodline breathing flawlessly at his side. He lunged forward. Blurring into lethal motion, he grabbed the nearest soldier. One brutal twist snapped the man's neck. Kevlar rustled. Another guard spun around, raising a tactical rifle. Before Bastian could pivot, a silver dagger flashed through the dim light. It buried itself deep into the guard's chest. The man dropped like a stone. Looking over his shoulder, Bastian watched the girl step out from behind a cement pillar. Her chest heaved. Cold, calculating focus hardened her features. She didn't flinch at the broken bodies. She stood like a queen reclaiming a stolen kingdom. Footsteps echoed down the concrete ramp. More soldiers poured into the narrow aisles. Silver rounds tore blindly into the shadows. Hot metal sparked brightly against the cinder block walls. "Move," Bastian barked the order. He grabbed her hand, yanking her behind a black SUV. Tempered glass shattered across their shoulders. Lead chewed through the car doors, pinning them to the floorboards. Building an empire meant nothing if he couldn't destroy it to save her. He popped up from behind the bumper, firing 3 precise shots. 3 traitors hit the pavement. Tunnel vision locked his focus on the muzzle flashes ahead. He missed the rogue shifter dropping from the steel rafters directly overhead. Boots scraped concrete. The girl shoved Bastian hard against the shattered window. She met the falling shifter mid-air. Using the attacker's own momentum, she flipped him onto the asphalt and drove her knee straight into his trachea. Bone crunched. Bastian stopped breathing. He swallowed the taste of copper, waiting for the echo to die off the brick walls before making a sound. Blood splattered her cheek. She wiped the red smear away with her thumb, looking at him with lethal fire. She was taking the leash off her power. Gunfire eventually faded into the hum of the overhead fluorescence. They had cleared the garage floor, yet the bloody tire tracks leading out to the street promised the war was following them home. Following the blind alleys away from the garage led them to a maintenance room hidden behind a false wall. Bastian threw the iron bolt. He slid down the door, letting his boots hit the floorboards as the adrenaline crashed. Silence rushed in to fill the dark. The fading high left behind a sharp ache. A stray bullet had grazed his shoulder during the retreat. It wasn't fatal, but the torn flesh burned like battery acid. Across the cramped room, the girl dropped her empty weapons onto a metal table. Steel clattered against the surface. Bastian waited for the noise to settle into the dust before opening his eyes. Footsteps crossed the floor. Her scent lost its sharp edge, fading from an ozone storm into warm rain. She knelt on the dirty linoleum, directly between his boots. "Let me see it." The whisper barely broke the quiet. He didn't argue. He let his skull fall back against the steel door. She peeled his ruined shirt away from the wound. Cool fingers brushed against his burning skin. The last wall, holding back his feral heart, cracked wide open. A ragged sigh tore out of Bastian's throat. He had spent his entire life playing the brutal protector. Nobody had ever tended his wounds like this. "I thought I lost my humanity," Bastian murmured. The words scraped against the quiet like sandpaper. "I thought the beast had won." She paused. Her gaze drifted away from the torn shoulder, locking onto his golden eyes. She didn't speak. Instead, she leaned in close, pressing her lips gently against the jagged scar on his jaw. Ozone flooded the tight space. The air between them caught fire. It was a deliberate surrender. Bastian reached up with a shaking hand. He tangled his fingers in her knotted hair, pulling her flush against his chest. She melted into the grip, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. Choosing her meant choosing to live. They consumed each other in the shadows. It wasn't just physical heat. Two broken souls violently slammed together to forge something whole. Every kiss was a desperate promise. Every touch claimed the territory. He worshipped her right there, on the cold floor. Gray morning light eventually bled through the air vents, shattering the peaceful illusion. Bastian woke to a rhythmic vibration traveling through the concrete. He opened his eyes. The girl slept softly against his ribs, her scent perfectly calm. Tires screeched against the asphalt directly above their hidden ceiling. Bastian stopped breathing. He mapped the mechanical growl of armored vehicles, dozens of them. Marcus had followed the blood trail, and the steel trap was finally snapping shut. The concrete ceiling buckled. A shockwave ripped through the foundation, throwing Bastian backward before his brain could process the noise. Dust and aerosolized silver powder choked the maintenance room. He hit the floorboards. The ceiling collapsed. A steel support beam crashed down, pinning his legs to the cracked concrete. Blinding, searing pain shot straight up his spine. The beam was laced with silver, burning into his flesh like a white-hot brand. Rubble buried him to his ribs. He coughed, spitting dark blood onto the dust. High-pitched ringing deafened his alpha hearing, but the vibration of combat boots kicking through the ruined door traveled straight through the floorboards into his skull. "Find the beast!" Marcus's voice cut through the dust. "Shoot him on sight!" Feral instinct demanded violence. Bastian clawed at the concrete. He fought the crushing weight to protect his territory and his anchor. His muscles didn't budge. A slender silhouette stepped out of the settling dust. It was her. Instead of running into the dark tunnels, she stepped directly into the red laser sights, painting the fog. "Stop." Her voice carried absolute royal authority. "Don't shoot." Bastian froze under the rubble. He tried to roar, but only a wet wheeze scraped past his teeth. Soldiers raised their silver-loaded rifles. What was Marcus going to do with a royal captive? The terrifying question burned like acid. "I am the silver-blooded heir of the Northern Pack." She held her bare hands high, stepping away from the rubble. "I surrender. Take me to Marcus. If you kill the Alpha, I will slaughter every single one of you myself." The armed men hesitated. The overwhelming weight of her true scent flooded the room. Sacrifice and sweet rain hit the back of Bastian's throat. A guard stepped forward. The butt of a tactical rifle slammed directly into her stomach. She dropped to her knees with a sharp gasp. Heavy chains locked around her wrists. Bastian watched them drag her away into the dark corridor. Her defiant eyes locked onto the pile of rubble, giving him one last look of pure, desperate love. The feral heart in his chest stopped. The monsters won. As the boots faded down the hall, Bastian lay in the suffocating dark, bleeding out from the silver, waiting for the madness to finally take the wheel. When a ship loses its anchor in a hurricane, it doesn't drift, it sinks. The maintenance room felt like a wet tomb. Bastian lay trapped beneath the steel beam. Every breath twisted a jagged knife in his lungs. The feral beast inside his skull began to thrash violently against the physical pain. How much silver could a lichen take before his heart stopped? He could feel his human pulse slowing down. A childhood memory surfaced: a wild wolf caught in a rusted bear trap. The animal didn't wait for help. It chewed its own leg off to escape the crushing steel. Bastian stopped fighting the beast. He surrendered the reins. The agonizing absence of her sweet scent ripped through his mind. A deafening, inhuman roar tore out of his throat. Bones snapped and cracked with sickening pops. Muscles bulged, tearing his clothes to shreds. Extreme trauma forced the shift. With every heartbeat, the man faded. The mindless lichen predator took absolute control. The beast dug its claws into the concrete. It shoved its massive shoulders upward. The steel beam groaned. Silver burned its fur, leaving blackened, smoking scars across its spine. The rabid monster ignored the pain. It heaved the crushing rubble aside, pulling its mangled body free. The beast stood up on two shaking legs as the sky darkened outside the bunker. Golden eyes vanished, replaced by a blank, terrifying red void. Bastian Thorne was gone. The human mind shattered into a million pieces on the tile floor. Instead of planning a tactical rescue, the mindless beast threw its head back and howled. Pure, unadulterated agony bounced off the brick walls. The feral creature smashed through the broken doorway. It began a blind, bloody trek across the neon-lit city, driven entirely by the primal urge to rip apart anything that smelled like the traitor who stole its mate. A rabid dog doesn't know why it bites until someone finally puts it down. Cold rain lashed the concrete courtyard of the syndicate headquarters. The feral beast that used to be Bastian stomped blindly through the iron gates. It didn't use the shadows. It walked directly into the center of the trap. Harsh spotlights snapped on, pinning the lichen in a circle of blinding white light. Dozens of soldiers stood on the high balconies surrounding the courtyard. Laser sights painted the monster's broad chest red. The beast stood in the pouring rain. Blood dripped from its jaws. Its red eyes darted wildly, confused by the bright lights and the shouting. It was completely surrounded. Gunfire erupted from the balconies. Silver bullets tore straight through the beast's shoulders. The monster roared in blind agony. It staggered backward, slipping on the slick, wet concrete. It lunged toward a stone pillar, but another round of silver chewed into its legs. Without the royal anchor to soothe its violent cells, the toxic silver acted as a fast-acting poison. The creature couldn't heal. The beast dropped heavily onto its knees. A low, pathetic whimper sounded completely heartbreaking over the crash of thunder. Fighting the dark was useless. The beast lowered its heavy head toward the wet pavement. It welcomed the cold end. Soldiers racked their rifles on the balconies, preparing to deliver the killing blow to the Mad King. All hope was entirely gone. Then, the wind shifted. Beneath the stench of gunpowder and spilled blood, the beast's nose twitched. It smelled sweet, fresh rain. It smelled crackling ozone. The intoxicating scent cut through the feral red haze like a silver knife. It was her. She was incredibly close. The beast slowly lifted its heavy head from the wet concrete. It stared blankly toward the glass doors of the VIP lounge. The anchor was pulling the sinking ship back from the deep. Gunpowder smoke washed out of the courtyard, stripped away by the freezing rain. Bastian lay crushed against the cracked concrete. Silver fire chewed through his veins, dragging his failing heart toward an absolute dark. He let it pull him under. Then, A sharp scent sliced through the blood-soaked air. Ozone and stormwater. The dying animal in his chest jerked. A brutal cough rattled his ribs as he forced his snout up from the slick pavement, staring blindly toward the VIP lounge. Glass detonated outward. Jagged shards sprayed across the wet courtyard. Syndicate soldiers flinched, dropping their rifle barrels as the noise slapped off the brick walls. Through the ruined doorway stepped a slender figure. Gone were the iron collars. Gone was the terror. She stood under the harsh floodlights, holding a silver blade loosely by her side. A violent shockwave hit the feral haze, blinding Bastian's mind, tearing the beast's aggression down to the studs. The animal didn't want to rip her apart. It wanted to drag its belly across the pavement and lay at her boots. Trapped in the suffocating black of the creature's skull, the human finally clawed his way up. He saw his queen. Up on the iron balcony, Marcus gripped the rail. The traitor's face warped with naked panic. "Shoot her!" Marcus screamed. "Kill the girl!" Rain hissed against the concrete. Nobody pulled a trigger. The weight of her bloodline pressed over the courtyard like a physical boot to the neck, freezing the mercenaries in place. With every slow step she took down the stairs, the silver poison lost its grip on Bastian's heart. He dug his ruined claws into the pavement, dragging his torso through the puddles, desperate to catch another breath of her storm-scented skin. Red laser sights tracked across her collarbone as she marched deeper into the kill zone, ignoring the downpour, plastering dark hair to her cheek. She didn't flinch away from the rifles. The freezing rain lashed against Bastian's torn back, washing the feral heat from his muscles. Control snapped back into his fingers. Up on the balconies, hardened killers shook. Rifles clattered against the iron grates as mercenaries dropped to their knees, crushed by the quiet authority radiating from the northern air. "Get up!" Marcus roared, waving a loaded pistol. "Shoot her!" They stayed kneeling. She stopped 2 feet from Bastian's mangled jaw. Dark eyes locked onto his, stripping away the last rotten layers of his madness. The brutal red void shattered. Golden light flooded his vision. Bastian swallowed a thick mouthful of copper. He dug his palms into the grit, shoving his shoulders off the ground. "I am Bastian Thorne," he rasped. A small smile touched her lips, cutting through the bleak storm. "I know who you are," she said. High above, metal scraped against metal. Marcus racked the slide of his pistol, aiming the barrel straight down at Bastian's spine. "Sin su commettre POV. Bastian." The sharp clack of the hammer locking back severed the quiet moment. Bastian's golden eyes snapped toward the high railing. "Tear her apart, you mindless dog!" Marcus screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Do it, or I put silver through your brain!" The traitor was banking on a rabid monster. He got an Alpha King instead. A low, mechanical rumble vibrated up Bastian's throat. It was a precise, lethal promise. He planted his boots into the slick concrete, uncoiling his giant frame to full height. The deep wounds in his thighs screamed, but he locked his joints, turning his broad back entirely to the frantic beta. He stepped toward the girl. Up on the catwalks, mercenaries choked on their own breath, waiting for the slaughter. She didn't raise her weapon. Instead, her fingers opened. The silver blade hit the pavement with a loud ring, bouncing into a dark puddle. She spread her arms wide, tilting her chin up to expose the fragile skin of her throat. Total trust. Adrenaline detonated in his chest, flushing the pain from his nerve endings. He became a loaded spring, and she held the pin. "Attack!" Marcus shrieked, firing a round blindly into the night sky. The gunshot echoed over the courtyard. Bastian pivoted, driving his steel-toed boots into the cracked concrete. Grit sprayed backward as he launched his entire weight upward, clearing the space in a single, brutal arc. He crashed onto the high iron balcony, bringing the violence straight to the traitor's front door. Concrete exploded under Bastian's boots as he slammed into the upper balcony. Iron railings buckled. Dust sprayed across the slick brick. Marcus scrambled backward, a wet, pathetic scream tearing from his throat. The traitor raised his pistol. A muzzle flash cut the dark. The gunshot cracked off the surrounding buildings. Ringing deafened Bastian's ears. He looked down at the bleeding hole in his chest. Silver fire flared, then instantly died. Scenting his queen through the rain anchored his roaring blood. The poison dissolved into harmless ash. Bastian didn't collapse. He drove forward, his hand clamped around the traitor's throat, pinning him against the freezing brick. A low, mechanical rumble vibrated up Bastian's throat, shaking rain from his shoulders. "I was going to sell her," Marcus choked out, blood smearing across his pale cheeks. "To the High Council. Pimp out his queen." The thought tasted like bile. Bastian curled his fingers. Talons slid from his knuckles, catching the harsh neon glow. He didn't roar. He just brought his arm across the traitor's neck. Bone snapped. Flesh gave way. The ruined body hit the grating with a wet thud. Rain hissed against the warm blood pooling on the metal. Bastian stood perfectly still. He swallowed the metallic taste coating his tongue, waiting for the feral red haze to swallow his mind. It never came. He breathed in the damp air. His head was brutally clear. He turned his back on the bleeding corpse. Walking to the broken ledge, he stared down into the courtyard. His leg muscles bunched tight, preparing for the drop. Wind roared past his ears. He slammed into the courtyard, cracking the wet pavement under his boots. The downpour had fractured into a freezing mist, coating the ruins in a gray wash. Across the rubble, she waited. Dark hair clung to her cheek. Bastian forced his joints to unlock. Tendons snapped and reformed. He ground his teeth against the brutal tear of shifting bone, shedding the beast. He wouldn't face her as a monster. He stood upright. Bare skin met the frigid air. Black blood and jagged scars covered his chest. His knees trembled, failing under the severe exhaustion. "Zoya," the rough rasp scraped out of his ruined throat. She crossed the distance. No hesitation. Her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, pressing her face against his bare chest. The ringing in his ears finally stopped. He buried his nose into her wet hair, breathing in ozone and storm water. Where her skin touched his bruised ribs, a strange heat bloomed. The silver burns stitched themselves shut, erased by her royal blood. Steel clattered against concrete. Bastian forced his eyes open. Up on the catwalks and across the ruined yard, mercenaries threw down their rifles. One by one, hardened killers dropped to their knees in the grit. They bowed their heads. Not just for him, for the fierce queen holding him together. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her flush against his side. "We're leaving," he whispered, stepping over the discarded guns and dragging her into the dark. "Sin ode komme tre POV, Bastian." Weeks of brutal restructuring finally gave way to silence. Morning sunlight cut through the tall penthouse windows, casting gold across the rumpled sheets. The violent nights in the courtyard felt like a distant nightmare. Bastian lay flat on the mattress. He watched her chest rise and fall. The scent of sweet rain settled deep into the warm room. She shifted. Dark eyes opened, catching the morning light. She didn't shrink away from his scarred frame. Instead, she reached out, dragging a single fingertip down the center of his chest. "You're staring." Her voice scraped the quiet air. "Looking at my world," he rasped. He rolled, pinning her gently against the mattress. She laughed a short, sharp sound and tangled her fingers in his hair, dragging his mouth down. He tasted salt and warmth. His rough thumbs pressed into her hips. He swallowed her soft gasp, letting his own quiet rumble vibrate between them. No feral rage, just a lethal, possessive calm. She kissed him back with equal violence, her nails digging into his shoulders. Eventually, the frantic movement slowed. Tangled in the white sheets, his lungs burned for air. He rested his forehead against her collarbone, listening to the steady thump of her heart. He traced the line of her jaw, his golden eyes narrowing at the bright city skyline. He would burn it all down to keep her safe. "Mine," he whispered against her skin.